Thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here, to be back in Colorado, driving up 85 to Golden today, seeing Mount Evans out there and the beauty of the land. It was inspiring. God's country for sure. Uh, but I live in Maryland now. So the talk tonight about global conflicts, can they be managed? Sky Forster asked me to take a look at this. And he's had me out before to talk to Colorado Springs chapter, Air Force Academy cadets, high schoolers, and such. And so I took it as a classroom assignment. You know, and when the doctor says, here's your assignment, here's my paper. I'm going to look at it differently, though, than probably most people look at things when it comes to global conflicts. I'm going to look at it through the lens of nationalism. Nationalism is something that exists, and we're going to get a little bit deeper into it. But nationalism is not the same anywhere. So one more slide there. There you go. So before we get going on it, there are three things I want you all to keep in mind. Thucydides, when he wrote the history of the Peloponnesian Wars 5,000 years ago, he wrote about fear, honor, and interest as the driving motivations of why Athens and Sparta went to war. And if you look at conflicts from then on out through this lens, it tells you a lot about why people are fighting. And if you don't know how to analyze a conflict through this kind of lens, you're never going to be a peace builder. You're never going to be a peace builder. Okay, next slide. So let's talk about nationalism. Nationalism, belief, creed, etc. You can read it up here. It is a neutral term by itself. But how a country or a group of people choose to implement their beliefs based on their nationalism is what assigns a value to it, positive or negative. And we're going to take a look at several categories of nationalism. There are some things here that will tell you what needs to be existing for a country to have a functioning sense of nationalism. They have to have a way to control the people. They have to have a sound economic system. For example, capitalism and democracy go hand in hand. It's very difficult to have a democracy like ours in a non-capitalistic environment. That doesn't necessarily mean that capitalism is good or bad. It's, again, how you implement it. So, next slide. There are 14 different categories here. I'd like for you to really pay attention to this column here in the first 6. America, God love us, we love to think that we are the standard, that we have civic standards that everybody adheres to, and that if everybody would just be like us, the world would be great. In all of the post-conflict settings I have been in, one of the first things we do is we want to hold elections. By God, you hold elections and the people have spoken. But are there political parties that are established, or are candidates being put up by, the criminal elements because the political economy doesn't exist? That sort of thing. It's tough, but this is our ideal. Then we have cultural nationalism. Cultural nationalism, where people share the common bonds that a culture imbues us with, language, religion, etc. I put the Kurds up here, and I do that on purpose because of how they have been mistreated over the years. The largest cultural group in the world today that does not have a sovereign state of its own are the Kurds. And that scares the hell out of Ankara. It scares the hell out of Damascus and Baghdad and Tehran, because if the Kurds were to have their own cult or sovereign state, all those countries would lose a lot of territory. Economic nationalism. Think of Napoleon and the continental system, protectionism, where he tried to damage England so much through an economic embargo that England would collapse. Ethnic, Bosnia. That's a great example where you had a collision of Muslim, Croat, and Serbs, and it still exists today. If you think Bosnia is resolved, you're wrong. It's just ticking, ticking, and ticking, but it's going to blow up again. If you have ever had a chance to read the book, A Peace to End All Peace by David Fromkin, I'd highly recommend it if you haven't. It's about the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the weak sister of Europe, as it was called during the World War I years. And it would give you a sound understanding of what happens when you have ethnic conflict. Then you have the good old expansionists. Today, that's Russia and China. Then we've got a variety of other ones. Liberation, nationalism was a part of our founding. We'll talk some more about that. National conservatism is a problem we have today. It's commonly referred to as illiberal democracy. And of course, National Socialism, we know about that. Pan-Arabism, a form of pan-nationalism, that's bogus, and it really doesn't work, but people still try to pursue pan-nationalistic goals. We have religious nationalism. If you look at ISIS, you look at Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and then romantic nationalism. Anybody know what the lost cause was? The South, yeah, bogus, entirely bogus. But there are parts of America today who really believe in perpetuating the lost cause as a form of nationalism. And they should be called out. Next. Dynamics here. I mentioned that we had the self-sustaining economic system, but nationalism basically is a response to a perception of a threat that is external to the country. We have different kinds of nationalism. Just because I had 14 different categories there doesn't mean a country is only one of those. A country is going to be a combination of those, but one will predominate. And that's the one that we're looking for as we do our analysis through interests, honor, and fear. The authorities try to establish a social contract with the people that would address how the system would work, how the governance system would be managed. More importantly, they require a charismatic leader. Hitler, Mussolini, you look at Saddam Hussein, you look at Vladimir Putin. Charismatic leadership is really a requirement here. And if you're going to change that in a particular country, force them to change their sense of nationalism, be prepared for it to take a generation. It takes a long time, which is something that we Americans don't like because we're impatient people. When we went into Iraq, we thought that all we had to do was overthrow Saddam and appoint some Iraqis that we liked, not that we really knew much about them, but we just liked them because they could speak English, and that we would then hold a quick election and go home. And we know how that turned out. I also want to talk some about spilled water. Nuclear non-proliferation, because that plays into some of what we're going to talk about later too, which is Ukraine. This slide shows you some of the requirements that the New START treaty that went into effect in February of 2011 laid on both Russia and the United States. It addressed the number of warheads both countries could have, the number of deployable systems, and the number of non-deployed warheads that could be held. Did not address what a lot of people call tactical nuclear weapons. Having worked on nonproliferation issues, that term I abhor, because there is no such thing as a tactical nuclear weapon. If you have a nuclear weapon go off, Pandora's box is now open. When we have Russia, which holds literally thousands of what they call tactical nuclear weapons in a variety of different forms, when they start talking about, we still have the nuclear tripwire in Ukraine, something you got to pay attention to. We'll talk more about that. In February of this year, Putin did not withdraw, but he halted his participation, suspended his participation in New START. The treaty still exists. It's still in force. It's just that the Russians, once again, have broken an arms control treaty. It happens all the time. Next slide. So I'm going to talk now about global conflicts. Global conflicts that the United States has been in. There are many more, but I'm going to talk about the ones principally that we have been in since we were founded. The first one is the American Revolution itself. Our history books like to describe the valiant fight of the American colonialists against the British Empire, when we were just a sideshow in the big picture. You had the French Empire, you had the Spanish Empire against the British Empire. And sure, yeah, the colonies, we fought for freedom, liberation, nationalism, that's what it was all about. And it resulted in the Articles of Confederation when all was said and done. But the war was much bigger. And when the Articles of Confederation were agreed to, they only lasted 11 years. And I would just point out that in the first sentence of the United States Constitution, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, what do you think they were talking about? Well, they were talking about what they had under the Articles of Confederation. And they were going to form a more perfect union, which meant that all of the states that existed then were in the new union. It wasn't going to be one where you could just come in, come out, whatever. That, in 1861, played a huge role in something that happened. So, American Revolution, next one. Shortly after our independence, historically speaking, we were involved in the Napoleonic Wars. Again, we were a sideshow. We were a sideshow in a war that was called the War of 1812. Against those British people who kept seizing American ships and inhibiting our economic nationalistic perspective. But again, it was a much bigger war. Again, between the French Empire, the British Empire, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungary Empire, et cetera, et cetera. And when all was said and done, by the time 1815 rolled around, we had the Peace Treaty of Ghent in 1815, where the British agreed, you guys got what you wanted. We won't mess with your ships or your exports anymore. We also got, in 1803, Louisiana Purchase, which expanded the United States. So things really were big for us, but on a global scale, we were small potatoes still. The thing that was interesting about how this war ended was that the Europeans devised a system. and a mechanism to use through the process that's referred to as the Congress of Vienna. And from that year of 1815 to 1914, peace was generally observed, at least on a global scale. You didn't have empires fighting each other around the world anymore. The empires were working with one another. Sure, they still had their fights. You know, Italy and France fought in northern Italy, several times as Italy tried to establish itself. You still had problems with Germany. Germany, once it formed itself, decided to attack France. These were bilateral things, not global things. But during this time, we had new technologies. We had new strategic plans that were being drawn up because of technological advances. We had new pressures that were evolving as peoples literally grew. Not like here in Jefferson County where the population's getting so small you're closing schools. You were having lots of people growing, and they were beginning to press on each other, especially in Southeast Europe, in the Balkans. And eventually, next slide, in 1914, the world had its first World War. And if you can see the colors here, the green were the Allies and the associated power. It's important to remember fear, honor, interest. The Woodrow Wilson administration did not deem participation as an ally was in the US's best interest. So what were we during World War I? Anybody remember? We started as an isolationist country, and in fact, in 1916, Wilson was reelected on the platform that he kept us out of the war. And about 14 months later, we declared war. We were the associated power. We were not an ally. And we were an associated power because we wanted to make sure that American forces were going to fight under American leaders. When the first US troops arrived in Europe, France and Britain were divvying us up amongst their own organizations, that we were just like a big replacement depot. And Wilson said no. And Pershing said no, the commanding general. And that's why we were an associated power. We were not allied. The war saw the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, as I referred to, the weak sister of Europe. We had international boundaries change. We had populations moving to escape new leaders. And we had a lot of violence that went on after that war. More importantly, we fell into the trap of the Treaty of Versailles. Versailles solved nothing. All it did was hit the pause button for 20 years until 1939 when everything went to hell again. Building peace is a very, very tough thing to do. In the 47 years that I have worked on war and peace issues for the United States, I have become a rather jaundiced person on how man operates, humanity operates. And I have come to the belief that the human condition, the natural human condition, is conflict. Whether you are sitting here as a business leader, trying to figure out how am I going to make more money for my company, that puts you into conflict with other people who are in your business sector, or whether you're somebody living in the wilds of Africa and you have to find something to eat and you're going to be in competition with other big game or other tribes. Conflict is what we do. That's what makes peace building so damn hard, because we are going against what's natural to us at our very basic and base level. That's my personal opinion. So I talked about the pause button. The pause button comes undone in 1939. It first begins between Germany, France, and England with the attack on Poland, the German attack on Poland. The idea the Germans were pursuing is stabilize everything in the east so we can then turn on the west and defeat France. And lo and behold, everything goes to work. It works. The plan works, which was quite surprising because as a former Army strategist, I learned also that no plan survives contact with reality. But a big player in helping Germany, Nazi Germany, achieve what it had to do was Stalin when he invaded Poland. And they had a quasi-peace between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, which allowed Hitler to then focus entirely on France and the Low Country, and you know your history there. The leaders of the United States at this time, Roosevelt, a guy named Marshall, Stimson, a variety of other diplomats and military leaders like Eisenhower and Patton and whatnot, they had fought in World War I. And they had witnessed the interwar years where we saw things going from bad to really worse. You know, the League of Nations that was created after World War I had no power. The U.S. never ratified Versailles, never joined the League of Nations. You know, how is that going to be an organization that is going to keep the world at peace? They saw what the recession, the global recession did, and how it impacted people and nations, you know, creating the sense of fear that I can't work with my neighbors anymore because if I do, I'm going to lose all my money. What's happening today when you look at the news? You see people participating in runs on banks merely out of fear. These men, and a few women, said at the end of World War II, we're not going to let this happen again. We are going to do something that we didn't do at the end of World War I. So the United Nations was created with an enforcement capability through Article 5, or Article 6 and Article 7. You had the UN Security Council established that allowed for the 5 major victors of World War II to sit permanently on this council, and everybody else got to rotate through according to a schedule. You had the World Bank created. You had the IMF created. You had a lot of NGOs created to try and help get us through this troubled time. And that was all because these leaders, these American leaders, had witnessed what had happened at the end of World War I, and were going to be dedicated to not letting that happen again. And so for a few years, we had things kind of working around the world. Next slide. But then, 47, we found ourselves in the Cold War. We had the creation of NATO in 1948. The Soviet Union countered with the creation of the Warsaw Pact. We had the creation of the European Economic Community. The Soviet Union countered with the creation of the Comintern, and so forth. But all of the blue states that you see identified here had an alliance of some sort with others, or they had good relations with others. We had a shared narrative. And as a former professor, shared narrative. At dinner tonight, we were talking about the schools and how they all have different things going on. America, when we were kids, had a shared narrative. Those damn communists, they're everywhere. You gotta fight them. Kennedy, in his inaugural speech, we will bear any burden, pay any price to defeat communism and protect the liberties of free people. Today, there is no shared narrative in America. None. And this is sad to say. And I don't have an answer on what we do to create a shared narrative again. But as Vietnam was winding down, American society was fragmenting. We had race riots. We had the emergence of a counterculture for the youth, et cetera, that just broke things apart. And now today, politically, you can't get people to agree to anything, rarely, of substance. And it's just very disheartening. So at the end of the Cold War in '91, we went into the war on terror a few years later. Look at the map. Look at all the colors. There's really no alliance there. There is no common narrative among the world itself. The numbers here refer to Al-Qaeda attacks, the twin embassy bombings that kicked it off, the second attack on the World Trade Center, 9/11, the Bali attack, the train attacks in Spain, in Liverpool and elsewhere in London or in England, and then the Calcutta attacks in India. One attack is not shown up there. But again, it's because, it's not something Americans really view as an attack that should worry us. Beslan, Russia, the 1st of September of 2004. Anybody remember what happened? Chechens attacked a school and took hostages. And over 330 people were killed, 189 of them school students. Up to that point in time, George W. Bush and Vladimir Putin actually had a working relationship. Bush's famous comment that I looked into his eyes and I could see the depth of his soul. People thought that there was going to be some good working relationship here. What we didn't understand was that a few days before Beslan occurred, a major Chechen leader was given sanctuary in the United States. And Putin could not understand that. And then this terrible attack occurs. And now he's convinced the United States really isn't his friend anymore. And everything began to slide away until we are where we are today. So let's hit the next slide. So we've gone through three major eras of national security. We went through the Cold War, remarkably survived it. We had Korea, we had the Berlin crisis, we had the missile crisis in Cuba, we had Vietnam, we had numerous coups in Latin America. The Middle East had lots of wars, pick whatever one you want. It just went on and on and on. But there was no global conflict, not violent global conflict. Post-Cold War, we had our Iraq, Desert Shield, Desert Storm. We had a couple of other minor things. Place called Panama, Just Cause, things like that. But again, no global war. Then we went through the war on terrorism. The United States fought some major wars, but it was mostly through coalitions of the willing, not through an alliance. Iraq and Afghanistan being two. So where are we now? We're in a new era, going back to nationalism, that I refer to the era of resurgent nationalism. And that's why that last map you saw lacked unity in the color system, because now national interests were taking over. Countries were no longer going to commit themselves to some alliance or something like that. because their national interests were now dominant in how they were going to exist. Next slide. So during this era of resurgent nationalism, here are some challenges and conflicts that the United States still deals with today in some form or fashion. They are categorized by the severity of impact they would have on the U.S., on its national security and foreign policy. So right at the top of the list, the war in Ukraine, the nuclear crisis in North Korea, we've got China, Taiwan, and the South China Sea. We've got Iran and its nuclear programs. A significant category, Pakistan and India. We don't want them to go to war. Afghanistan, we don't want it to become another base for international terrorism. Turkey and the Kurds, that could undo the Middle East far worse than any Israeli-Arab war could do. And then we have the limited challenges, things that we're keeping an eye on, but we don't have the resources to fully commit anything much to. This list is not mine. This came from the Council of Foreign Relations, which you can find online at their site. So the potential threats, as I said, national interests now override international interests. And we have a disaggregation of regional and international goals because of the emphasis on national interests. We have increased potential for forced migration, both within countries and across international boundaries. Increases in risk-taking in security, diplomatic, and economic realms. Alliances, whether they're based on a formal treaty or whether they are a coalition of the willing, might not live up to expectations. And people will get tired and they won't want to continue working on them. As we can see now with Ukraine, with a part of the country saying, Ukraine is not our business. You know, they're wearing out. The idea of a grand strategy. Can't do it. Cannot do it. The world is too chaotic and it's non-polarized. That makes it very difficult to create a grand strategy that will address all of these challenges at one time. So how would you prioritize those? Next. How do you counter negative nationalism? Here are some ideas. The first is having that unified narrative. You know, when a country like the United States cannot agree to have a common perspective on the world, it will lack the ability to establish a grand strategy. Grand strategies begin with people accepting a common perspective. You need to have strong and agile, flexible diplomacy and humanitarian assistance efforts. And in the United States, it's our State Department colleagues, it's USAID, both of whom, every 2 years, when a budget is discussed in the House of Representatives, those two organizations are always top of the list for being underfunded. And my former organization, the U.S. Institute of Peace, is always at the top of the list for elimination. You have multilateral organizations that can do good stuff if people pay attention and support them. The United States funds 22% of the UN budget. You know, we believe in it and we put our money where our mouth is. We have deterrent alliances. We have NATO. And then we've got 5 defense treaties in the Pacific region. They're all bilateral, but the United States is the unifying force in the Indo-Pacific region. Coalitions of the willing. We have international agreements or arrangements such as NORAD, the Quad, etc. And just as important as all of these, a healthy international and domestic civil society where these people who live there can be empowered to take care of their own problems. Next slide. So let's talk about Russia and how we got to where we are with Russia. This map shows you how Russia grew from being the Duchy of Muscovy, this little green area right here, and over the centuries became what you now see today. There have been some changes with the collapse of the Soviet Union, but Russia has always been an expansionist territory, expansionist state, principally because it lacked natural barriers. Sure, it had the Ural Mountains, but it also lacked people in the Ural Mountains who would fight the expansion of the Russians going east across Siberia. The Russians also became to believe that the way you dealt with problems with foreign countries next to Russia is you gobbled them up. You didn't try to negotiate things, you would just gobble them up. Like here in the Caucasus here. Those guys have always been a problem for the Russians, centuries ago. But in 1868, the Tsar decided, I got an answer. We're just going to go in there and conquer it, and it'll become part of Russia. But that's like eating a piece of cancer and saying, oh, I'm going to cure myself. You know, doesn't work. They still have issues. Russia still has issues with Ukraine. That began in 2014 with Crimea and the bogus activities in the Donbass, and now we've got a full-fledged war. Estonia, they have a border dispute with Estonia that involves about 750 square miles. But why can't they do anything with Estonia? NATO. Estonia is a member of NATO now. Japan, the Kuril and Sakhalin Islands that Russia conveniently took from Japan in the last 5 days of World War II, knowing full well at the time that we were going to drop a nuclear weapon. And then Georgia, where the Russians claim that they are going to protect Russian-speaking people in Georgia and South Ossetia and Abkhazia, because it is the Russian mandate to protect Russian speakers wherever they are in the world. So I'm waiting for the headlines of the Washington Post to come out and say the Russians have landed at Brighton Beach to see what's happened out there. Next slide. Okay, Ukraine's invasion. This has been in the works for a long time. Putin is like any of us. He's not crazy. He knows that he is going to disappear from this earth at some point in time. But he wants his legacy to be that he's the guy that recreated the Russian Empire. And he knows his time is, he's my age. And he knows his time is coming to a close. And he's going to get it done, which is why Ukraine has now occurred. Okay? It's a massive blunder by Russia. They have completely blown this war. The bottom line is Ukraine can win this war if Ukraine is supported by its friends. And that's something that you can take to the bank. We can support them now and defeat Russia in conventional conflict, or you can let Russia overrun Ukraine, but the war will not end then. If you study the Eastern Front in World War II, you will find that the partisan war that occurred behind the Nazi lines was all in Ukraine. And it was horrific. And believe me, the Ukrainians know how to fight partisan wars. So the Russians are going to wind up with a big problem, one way or the other. Russia is a persistent power, but they're a wounded power. And that makes for reckless decision-making. It makes for irrationality, less predictability. What happened over the Black Sea yesterday? The takedown of the American drone by a couple of Russian fighters. That was not the call of a flight squadron commander operating out of Crimea. That came from Putin. He's sending a message to the United States. Are we reading it correctly? I think we have, but we'll see how he reacts to it. He still retains a great deal of potential in his military because of this nuclear arsenal. He sees it much similar to what used to be called the line of Ukraine, or the line of Crimea, back in 1736 to 1739, when the Empress Anna took Crimea for the first time. They thought they could do it in 1 year. That took them 3. And the logistics that they used to support the Tsarist forces in the field were just as abysmal as what they've got here now. And the Russian army was convinced the only way you could win is to throw tremendous numbers of blood shed, or soldiers and material at your enemy and fight a war of attrition. And that's what Putin's doing now. He's fighting a war of attrition because that's the way the Soviets and the Russians have always fought. He also believes that Ukraine is a civilizational war, that we want to destroy Russia. And so this is all about existentialism, or the ability of the Russians to exist. He has the option to back off, maintain a war that is hot, cold, while rebuilding his conventional forces. But that's going to take about 15 years. How many of you ever served in the military? I know you did. Okay. Do you remember when you enlisted or were commissioned, you went to one particular place where you were taught the basics of what you were going to do, right? Yeah? Kinda, yeah. But it was basic training. In Russia, they don't do that. In Russia, if you get called up through a mobilization like Putin did last fall and is considering doing again, you get assigned to a regiment and you report to that regiment, and the regiment's responsible for training you, which means there is no commonality, no consistency in training standards throughout the Russian army. So if you're in Unit A and you're reassigned to Unit B, you may have to start all over again because Unit B does things differently. And that's a major problem for the Russians to work out. That's why it's going to take them a long time to make meaningful changes. They are looking at non-conventional activities. They're looking at cyber. They're looking at artificial intelligence, chemical, biological, radiological warfare. And they're becoming much more comfortable with the idea of the use of a nuclear weapon. But as I said, you explode a nuclear weapon of any size, and Pandora's box is now open. And it's just going to be hell for the world. They will not commit to any new arms control treaties, guarantee on that. They want to strengthen their strategic ties with China, but the Chinese are keeping them at an arm's distance because they're not quite sure if they want to get too saddled with what Russia could collapse into. And they want to destabilize the EU because they see if you destabilize the EU politically, political will disappears, NATO becomes neutered. So, next. So what are our concerns and options? Don't expect this war, this conflict, to be short-term. We're in a new Cold War. And it's going to go on through the rest of our lives and through our children's lives and probably our grandchildren. Ukraine is vital to Europe's security. To allow Russia to win in Ukraine means international borders are no longer meaningful. Might can overcome what sovereignty has created. We can, as the leader of the free world, we cannot allow that to happen. We have to maintain Ukraine and help them. Again, grand strategy, it's not possible, but we've got to figure this one out. I don't have the answer to that. We need to be more holistic in how we approach the issue of conflict. It cannot be a DoD, State Department-led effort. It has got to be done differently. You've got to involve Treasury. You've got to involve Commerce. You have to involve all of the executive branch. Because if you don't, you're going to leave DoD holding the bag for the most part. And that's not good. We have to remain engaged with Europe's security. Remember what we were discussing after the end of World War I, where the US became isolationist, only to have to go back and pay in more blood and treasure in World War II. You know, we have got to remain engaged with them. We have to try and maintain strategic ambiguity in how we deal with Russia so that they cannot read us like a book and decide how they're going to, you know, outsmart us. Keep sanctions and enforce them. Engage India. India matters. It matters. And India is now the most populous country in the world, not China. And then seek a separate bilateral non-proliferation treaty with China. Trying to have a trilateral non-proliferation treaty is not going to work. Logically, you start picking it apart. It does not work. You have to have a bilateral agreement. But the long-term thing we have to remember, we want to reestablish a stabilized relationship with Moscow and with Beijing. So all goes back to nationalism, understanding how they think. Because if we don't understand how they think, we're not going to be able to counter them or to create the necessary mechanisms for peace. Next slide. So can global conflicts be managed? They can, but principally through prevention. And that's why it's important for us to remain engaged. That's why it's important for us to work with the Department of State and keep them funded and keep them growing. That's why we need to have a relook at how DoD and the Department of State work with one another. If you took a map from Secretary Austin's office of how the world is divided up by DoD and all the various commands, and if you took a map from Secretary Blinken's office and how State Department divides the world up in all these bureaus, you're going to find that they don't match. They don't match. Yeah, exactly. One of the things that inhibits our ability to respond to international crises is our slowness in making decisions in Washington, D.C. Because over the decades, across numerous administrations, the National Security Council has become the spot where all of that gets done. But it's like trying to involve somebody who's overwhelmed with too much information. We don't empower the Secretary of, the Assistant Secretary for Asia Pacific. We don't empower that person with the same power that the commander of U.S. India Pacific Command in Hawaii has. Our diplomat sits in Washington. The admiral sits in Hawaii. Who's going to be in a position to make a faster decision relative to what's happening in the Indo-PACOM region? Those things have to be worked out. And it's, if you decide to write your senator or congresswoman, especially if they sit on a foreign affairs committee or an armed services committee, something you might want to ask them about. Dealing with global conflict is long term. It's not short. World War I was a perfect example where we thought, hey, November 11th, 1918, everything's done. Let's go. And 20 years later, bingo, we're right back. We need to stay engaged. And that's why bodies like yours are so important, because you are influential in your communities, especially with your students. And we need to get them educated so that they assume responsibility that we have to pass on to them. So ladies and gentlemen, I leave you with a bleak thought, okay? You know, conflict is our natural state, but it doesn't mean we have to accept it. And because we succeed at one point in time in resolving a conflict doesn't mean that we're done. Because in the next 24 hours, there's something else that comes up that just has to be addressed. This is how humans live together. We have to deal with these things. So I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this excellent presentation. If you assume that, that the United States, that Biden has really 1 year to work out something in Ukraine, on the basis, and this assumption, it may not be correct, but it would be difficult to imagine a year from now, United Nations all pulling, NATO all pulling together still, and the Republicans not really taking pot shots at Biden with the election coming up. So getting to the point is, what can Biden do to scare Putin into negotiating and have the United States, have the UN come in with monitors for, let's say, an election in the three areas in eastern Ukraine, and an independent monitor, again, monitoring election in Crimea to see if they want to go with Russia or not. I mean, if that was something that was in the cards, and then if there was a peacekeeping mission by the UN permanent in Ukraine to keep the peace, and have it part of the understanding be that Ukraine would not be entering NATO. It would be like Austria after the Second World War, neutral. So could all this be sort of parts of the puzzle that could be a solution? But how do you get Putin there? Because he's thinking probably if he can just hang on for another year, the U.S. and its allies are going to start having trouble. So that's a complicated question, but a very important one.
Well, thank you for that question. It's, the short answer is Putin is under a great deal of internal domestic pressure right now. Will he survive is another apt question to ask. He has his oligarchs who are loyal to him, but their patience is running thin because they are losing money like crazy, principally through the sanctions that the West has imposed. The Russian people are not growing, so they're losing a lot of people, not only today in Ukraine, where, by the way, 97% of the Russian army is now committed. 97% of their army is committed to Ukraine. Russia has got lots of trouble that has to be taken into account. I think the odds are that Putin won't survive beyond what the West is willing to endure. Putin is thinking how Napoleon treated alliances. You break the alliance up, you break off one person from the alliance. And the attack yesterday over the Black Sea could have been an effort to begin trying to escalate the scope of the conflict so that it puts more pressure domestically on the countries that create NATO and any other friendly countries involved. But Putin has got to get by his own folks. I think that that is a more likely occurrence, that he will disappear. But then who takes over? Better the devil you know than the devil you don't, kind of thing. As far as holding elections, again, you know, elections have been held before. It's just that Russia, you know, set up phony elections with phony results in Crimea and in the Donbass regions. So he will rely on those election results. He'll say, why do I need more elections? The UN is an interesting topic of discussion. I mentioned earlier that the UN's mission is to preserve international peace. It has a bit more backbone in it through Article 6 and Article 7. But generally, the UN peacekeeping missions are more based on monitoring and reporting what people find. Look at Cyprus, the longest peacekeeping mission the UN has had. And it's that those troops there are empowered to only observe and report violations of the armistice. Okay? Turkey invaded and seized half of Cyprus. The UN couldn't do a thing about it. Now, the UN is learning, so it's beginning to understand that it needs to have the ability to crack the whip on belligerents. So, for example, it worked with NATO in Bosnia, mixed results. It's worked with NATO in Kosovo, better results, but still a lot of work to be done. If you look at the Democratic Republic of Congo, the UN had an observe and report mission for years in eastern Congo, in the area that we call the Great Lakes. Again, ethnic conflict, cultural conflict. I mean, there's just a whole list of different things going on there amongst all the tribes that live there. And it got so bad that finally the UN created a new doctrine for peace operations that it referred to as robust peacekeeping. And the mandate for that force gave the force commander the authority to use force, military force, to engage with and destroy insurgent groups that were operating. And last count that I had, and I know it's undercounted now, was there were 23 separate entities in that region fighting each other. To be a civilian in that part of Africa, it was just horrible, because there were other people that were just going to kill you just as they'd look at you. And so that worked. It worked for a few years, but then the mandate ran out. Who creates the mandates in the United Nations? The UN Security Council. Oh, at the end of this month, who takes over as the president of the UN Security Council? Russia. That's kind of like putting the fox in charge of the hen house, isn't it? So, what do we do about that? Now, there are options out there. I won't go through them all because it'll put you to sleep. But we're going to have to live with Russia for 30 days as president of the UN Security Council. Last spring, they became president of the Security Council after they invaded Ukraine. And they took the opportunity to change rules on some minor issues. And those minor issues never even attracted the news interests of the Western world. But Russia made damn sure that the countries in Africa and in the Middle East and in parts of Asia knew that there's a new boss in town at the UN Security Council, and we've made changes to the rules that will benefit you small countries. And you can bet they're going to do the same thing now. So I don't know if I answered that very difficult but very pertinent question.
Got another question here and there.
Yes, sir.
There is a school of thought led by, I think, a man named John Mearsheimer from University of Chicago, which places the blame of this Ukrainian war at the feet of the West. And essentially he argues, I think, that it was NATO's expansion eastward after the fall of the Soviet Union. It was Clinton's decision to get involved in Serbia without Russian input and so forth and so on, and some of the West's support for the color revolutions in the Ukraine and some of the other former Soviet republics. And I wonder if you could comment on that and maybe address whether these are valid claims or whether they are not.
Well, Mearsheimer is a he's a very complex character, and he comes up with lots of ideas that simply don't hold water. The process of joining NATO is not made in Brussels. It begins with a national decision in some country who applies for NATO membership. Look at what has happened in Stockholm and in Helsinki. They both applied for NATO citizenship or membership. And NATO then has to run them through a process that's quite long to make sure that they have the right ideals, the values, the civic nationalism that NATO agrees to. But it's not NATO pushing the boundaries out. It's a national capital pushing it out. In the case of the expansion into the former areas of the Warsaw Pact, those 9 countries that form the East 9 of NATO, every one of them made a choice to apply for NATO's membership, and they passed the test and they became NATO members. It wasn't NATO walking over there and saying, oh, you're now a member. So Mearsheimer's, he doesn't portray it correctly. The idea of the Russians complaining about Kosovo and Bosnia, again, Russia knew what was going on, and they did have forces on the ground. If you remember when we were in Bosnia, the Russians flew in an airborne brigade, actually without even telling NATO, and that suddenly here are these planes landing and Russian airborne troops are getting off. So Russia knew what was going on. They're just trying to obfuscate the situation. And now with Putin and his disinformation techniques, I don't buy into a lot of what the Russians have to say now. And this comes from a guy who has worked with the Russian military.
How about the argument that the U.S. fomented some of the Orange Revolutions and the Maidan Revolution in Ukraine, that we were behind them?
Bill Taylor is a friend of mine, and he adamantly says that did not happen. He was the ambassador there twice. It was the Ukrainians throwing out a corrupt regime that the Russians had imposed on Kyiv, and that the Ukrainian people were the ones that incited their Orange Revolution. It was not the U.S. trying to do it. I mean, when you think about everything you saw on that slide of conflicts and secondary things and whatever, the U.S. has a lot of stuff going on. And to try and focus on doing something like we did in Guatemala in 1954, it just doesn't pass sense because we don't have enough resources now to do it. And again, we lack a unifying narrative that Americans could stand behind. So, no, that's just Russian propaganda again. So.
We have another question up front, and then we'll get to the other side.
Do you think an external threat to the U.S. would create the kind of cohesive narrative that's lacking?
That's generally how nationalism gets reinforced, is that perception of something external to the country that's posing a threat. You look at 9/11. We were unified, at least for a bit, after 9/11, because we saw something that happened to us. Just a side story, I was in the Pentagon and that damn plane flew literally right under me. That's why I wear hearing aids today. I lost my hearing in the Pentagon. That unifies people, but I'd hate to say that, gosh, let's allow something like that to happen. There is this theory that Roosevelt knew Pearl Harbor was going to be attacked and he was going to allow it to happen because it would instantly unify America. I think that's kind of been torn apart. But nonetheless, if there's something external that happens, it does have a tendency to unify people. Sure does.
We're on this side now.
Do you think Turkey will ever become part of NATO?
Turkey is part of NATO.
Well,
It's a not very cooperative part of NATO, but if you're thinking the EU,
that's what I meant.
yeah, at one point in time, there was a strong movement for Turkey to become part of the EU, but Turkey and France had difficulties between themselves. And that was a previous leader of Turkey who experienced that. And now with Erdogan, he says, I'm not interested in the EU. Because it would force fundamental changes in governance in Turkey, and he's not willing to accept those changes because it would ruin his ability to stay in office. So I wouldn't hold out a lot there.
Yes, why do Scott Ritter and Colonel McGregor, two pretty well-respected individuals, have a different take on what's going on in the Ukraine?
Well, I can't really, say that they shouldn't say what they say. Doug McGregor and I don't see a lot eye to eye on a lot of different things. But I'm not quite sure where to begin answering that. They're entitled to their opinions.
Just a question on comparing the value or the importance of all the political influence or that Putin is using to press his viewpoint. How valuable is the efforts on the war crimes? At this point, it seems like that's really not going to go very far.
Well, they can try. The Ukrainians have been trying Russian forces and have sentenced Russians to prison. Some in absentia, some they actually have in the pokey right now. But the bigger issue is the UN wanting to initiate war crimes trials against Putin. And certainly that can move forward, but it's not going to produce any tangible result unless Putin submits himself to the Hague. So now, justice delayed is justice denied, as Martin Luther King said, and that applies here. And Kyiv wants to make sure its people know that they are seeking justice for the Ukrainians of Bucha and elsewhere who were slaughtered by Russian forces. And that's important. That's a form of closure for them. So.
Thank you for your talk this evening. What is your sense about how we create civic nationalism in this country, notwithstanding staying involved with the world, but we have 1% of our people who do military service, and they're mostly people of color, and they're, quote, volunteers, but nobody else has any skin in the game in terms of giving back to this country and what it means and what privileges we have. What's your sense about what would work in terms of national service, whatever that might mean, military, medical, whatever that would be?
That's a great question. There are a couple of things I've thought about. National service, and whatever format you want to create it, I think is important for the youth of America, so that they meet different people from across the country and can bond with them. And as you know from your time in the military, you had a lot of people around you those first 2 weeks of basic training where you were trying to figure out, well, what's that Texan really saying? I don't understand Galveston, It's an educational process. And I'm disappointed in our public schools that have removed civics education. I think that's where we really need to reinforce it. And organizations that have emphasized loyalty to the nation and to the American people, to helping others, such as scouts. That's important. But there's another angle to this that I think needs to be addressed too. You know, we have 435 members elected into the House of Representatives that represent a country of, I don't know, 535 million people. Okay, you do the math. And how does one representative really know what the constituents in their district really are interested in, what is important to them? You all get the emails from your representatives, God knows I do, and they want us to take a survey, but the survey is always going to be limited to what they already know they want to pursue in their term in Congress. There's no free-flowing information. The Senate is what the Senate is. 2 representatives for each state of the Union. The House of Representatives has grown over the course of our history. One time we had 39 members of the House, and we're up to 435 now. And we have a law that says that's it, we're not going to expand. I think that needs to be relooked. I think that the House of Representatives needs to be expanded so that there are representatives who can get down and listen to the people more and help them bond in their own districts. I just don't see it in today's House.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you for a very thought-provoking, thought-provoking presentation. I've got lots of things I'd love to ask you, but let me say first, I think the greatest national security threat to the United States is us. We ourselves have the future in our hands, but as you pointed out very clearly at the beginning, there's no real national narrative. One political party or one politician gets elected, 2 years, 4 years, the next one tries to tear down what that president or senator did. So I would say to everybody in this room, if we don't get our act together as Americans around a narrative, around a variety of things that we believe in and that we can stand for around the world, we're not going to have the alliances we need. We're not going to show frankly, the power that we need to show to those who potentially are against us. Which brings me to the question of China, which we haven't really talked about a lot. Think about China. I have a lot of problems with China. We've lived and worked there for many, many years. But I have real concerns, as others do, about where China is trying to take the world. I don't agree with our current policies. In many ways, I think we need to take a different approach. But I'd throw out the idea that China has much, much more of a narrative, and particularly a national security narrative, than we appreciate. Xi Jinping has just begun talking about a global civilization where he's going to reach out around the world, probably successfully, to a fair number of people or other countries about how we can all work together, by the way, with China leading the way. So I think we need to think again about how we engage diplomatically as well as in other ways with China, because China's not going away. They've got their own problems and challenges, which I think will undermine them. But for the foreseeable future, they've got a national narrative that we don't really know how to control. I don't know whether you want to say some more about China. I've gone on longer than I should have. But I do think, yeah. So the question is, do you have some thoughts about China and how we can come up with a set of policies that might be more successful?
Well, you personally know a hell of a lot more about China in your little finger than I know in my entire brain. I mean, China is a big, big power that has to be worked with. We'll compete with China. You know, we'll compete with China in business. We'll compete with China in terms of ideas. But in some cases, we're just not doing it very well because we're not prepared to do it. We're focused on other things. China, my personal view is the number one issue for China right now is maintaining the loyalty of 1.3 billion people to China. Now, they've got the political governance system established to make people either stay quiet or actively support the Communist Party. But the thing that Xi Jinping and a lot of his circle understand is that to maintain that loyalty, they better bring energy back to China. And as you know from your time there, Chinese domestic energy is not all that great. You can go to West Virginia and pick up some anthracite, put a match to it, and it burns just great. The coal that you dig up in China, you're going to have to pour oil on. And where does that oil come from? Certainly, China doesn't have a big oil industry. When I was working with the Indian Navy, they were asking me about China, and I asked them back. I said, "Why do you think China wants a blue water navy?" Because for decades, the Chinese Navy was nothing. It was brown water, coastal, interference, basically. But now they have a Navy that can truly go out in the high seas and compete with other Western navies. They don't have combat experience, but they certainly have some good ships. So when I was asking the Indians about that, I said, why do you think they want a blue water navy? And they really hadn't thought about that. I said, well, it's the Persian Gulf, and why do we take note that they brokered a deal between Tehran and Riyadh? Because they're trying to set the conditions for them to build their own refineries in the Persian Gulf so that they can bring the oil back to China. It's that sort of thing that I think Xi Jinping is primarily concerned with, but a close second is going to be Taiwan. He wants to reunite China, and that means bring Taiwan back home. And that obviously is a major sticking point. The Hong Kong solution for Taiwan would not work. Again, this is like changing international boundaries. You can't allow it to be done forcefully. It has to be done diplomatically. And who are our experts? Well, you're one of them, but you're long in the tooth like I'm long in the tooth. Where are the youngsters? And that goes back to the question we had in the back, how do you get people into national service?
Thank you. That question concludes our program. Please help me in thanking Colonel Paul Hughes.